Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Avi, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into the discussion of Maia Szalavitz, Undoing Drugs, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Switching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by the third generation owner, Nancy Bass Whiting. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors, we wouldn't be here today. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Maia Szalavitz for the launch of her new book, Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. Maia Szalavitz is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Unbroken Brain, A Revolutionary New Way of Understanding Addiction, which she received the 2018 Media Award from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Her earlier book, Hope at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids, was first to expose the damage caused by the tough love business that dominates youth treatment and helps spur congressional hearings on the matter. She also co-authored 6 other books, including the classic on child trauma, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Jew, with Bruce D. Perry. In addition, she has written essays and features for numerous publications from High Times to New York Times. Moderating tonight's event is Joanne Hadi. Joanne Hadi is a British writer who has authored 2 New York Times bestselling books. They have been translated into 37 languages. His first book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, was adapted into the Oscar-nominated film The United States versus Billie Holiday. His second book, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and then the Unexpected Solutions, was described by the British Journal of General Practice as one of the most important texts of recent years, and shortlisted for an award by the British Medical Association. John's TED Talks have been viewed more than 75 million times. He has written over the past decade for some of the world's leading newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, the Spectator, the Melbourne Age, and Politico. He has appeared on NPR's All Things Considered, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, the Joe Rogan podcast, and the BBC's Question Time. John was twice named National Newspaper Journalist of the Year by Amnesty International. He has also been named Cultural Commentator of the Year and Environmental Commentator of the Year at the Comment Awards. Joining Maya and Joanne in conversation tonight is Lisa Moore. Lisa Moore was a co-founder of the National Harm Reduction Coalition in the United States. She was born and raised in Oakland, California, and was a grateful passive recipient of the Bay Area ambience of the 1960s and 70s. She studies at UC Berkeley, where she earned a doctorate in public health in 1993. She has worked in reproductive justice, HIV prevention, and in harm reduction. Currently, she teaches in the public health department at San Francisco State University. Her interests are in the social production of disease with a focus on the impacts of the drug war and of neoliberal racial capitalism. Additionally, she practices and teaches at East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, California. At its best, she views harm reduction as a curative to the drug war, to the individualism of neoliberal racial capitalism, as it restores and reinforces social ties and interconnection. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Maya, Joanne, and Lisa to the stage.
Hey everyone, thanks so much, Avi. Cheers. I'm so glad you're all watching. I wish we were all, in fact, in the Strand, which is one of the greatest places in the world. But sadly, you might have noticed there have been some events in the world that have prevented us from all meeting. So I'm super psyched that we're here today. Maya is one of the, we're going to be talking today with 2 just totally amazing women who've done such important work. And we're going to be talking most importantly about one of the innovations in human history that has most saved human life. And we're obviously going to be focusing on Maya's amazing book, Undoing Drugs. Maya, can you just hold up a copy so people can wave it at the camera? Have you got one? Just want to say, I know Maya a little bit, but generally we kind of orbit each other because we write about kind of somewhat overlapping subjects. I don't know any writers who work as hard as Maya and do such diligent research and do it in such a spirit of love and compassion. And obviously, as you've heard, Lisa is an absolute legend in harm reduction. So I just wanted to start, and we're going to come to her amazing work in a little while. So I wanted to start with asking you, Maya, why did you write the book? Why is harm reduction so important to you?
Sure. So first of all, it saved my life personally. If a person hadn't been visiting from San Francisco in 1986 and I was shooting up with a friend who turned out later that he was HIV positive, I might well have gotten infected. In New York at that time in 1986, about 50% of all IV drug users were already infected, and I didn't even know I was at risk. It was astonishing. And so as soon as she taught me to use bleach to clean my needles, I was compulsive about it. And I was just angry because I felt that why are we just letting people die of ignorance? It makes no sense. We could spread it to other people if you don't care about us. I just was absolutely horrified by the lack of care. And eventually when I got into recovery, I began to try to find out, where did this come from? Who did this? What is this idea about? And I learned about harm reduction. And it was just starting at that time in the UK. The Netherlands had had the first ever needle exchange, which was founded by a guy named Nico Adrians, who named it the Junkie Union because he wanted to destigmatize that word. And he began giving needles out during an outbreak of hepatitis B before the HIV virus was even discovered. And so the Netherlands has always been much more pragmatic about drugs than we are. And so they started doing this, and they had this already there when HIV hit, and they massively expanded it. The UK people in Liverpool saw this, and they were like, right up the road from us is Edinburgh, and they have a massive HIV. Like when they first started testing for HIV in Edinburgh, 50% of their IV drug users were already positive. And these were young people, and everyone was freaking out. And Liverpool had just as much IV drug use as Edinburgh did, but they didn't have any HIV yet. And so they're like, we better do something. And they began needle exchange. And they also expanded a policy called the British system, which had been in existence since the 1920s or so. And that was, if somebody's addicted to something, prescribe them a safe supply of it so that they don't have to deal with the consequences of the illegal, impure supply. And so they were prescribing heroin and cocaine, and they were seeing remarkable results in terms of people getting their lives back, no HIV epidemic in their IV drug users. And so a group of people there coined the term harm reduction and decided, okay, we are going to try to take this idea to the rest of the world because it seems like a much better approach to drug policy than focusing on fighting drugs. The idea that harm should be the enemy makes a lot more sense. I don't care if you're getting high or euphoric. I mean, good for you, that's fine. But I do care, and as a policymaker, it is okay for me to care if you are hurting yourself or others. And that's where policy should have a role. I don't think the government has any role saying like, oh, you shouldn't have that pleasure. But it certainly has a role in if you're hurting yourself and other people. And so harm reduction makes a ton of sense, which is why for a long time, the government tried to suppress it.
Yeah, it's the second best thing to ever come out of Liverpool after the Beatles as a British
Exactly.
person. I have to say that. But so Lisa, you were one of the absolute pioneers of bringing this approach to the United States. Could you tell us a little bit about how you first got involved in this?
I think stumblingly, like most people. I had a youth of engaging in nefarious activities, not the least of which was drug use. And like most people, I did what I think is called maturing out of it. And I put that in quotations, right? I just at some point was like, this is not working. And because I had a lot of relative privilege, I went to grad school, which also can be part of this process for people, is being able to kind of take on another identity. And while I was in grad school, I needed to do a research project, and with person Lynn Wenger, who's still doing harm reduction work, we started doing a ethnography of the needle exchange that started here in San Francisco. It had started Day of the Dead, 1988, I believe, and we started doing the research in 89. And it's always strange when you're researching. I mean, I studied public health, and too much public health is researching the obvious so that we can make the point that it actually works, right? And I felt that immediately researching harm reduction. It was like, okay, we're giving out condoms to people because we don't want them to get HIV. And we know that people might not use condoms, but we also know if they don't have condoms, they're going to get HIV. Same logic with needles, right? But it wasn't. And I found myself fascinated by that. I found myself fascinated by the fact that we could get arrested for doing public health. I found myself fascinated by the fact that there was so much stigma and so much, what I later found was the overlay of kind of the transmutation of, what Michelle Alexander called the new Jim Crow, with the whole drug war thing. I found myself fascinated with all of this stuff that was on top of just this very simple, basic, ridiculously easy public health. Where all this other crap was getting in the way of something that was basic. So I did needle exchange for some years, and then George Clark and Dan Big got funded by Stephanie Comer to start the Harm Reduction Coalition. And for whatever reason, George dragged me into that mess, which was, it was again, kismet, but glorious kismet. I feel like I was really fortunate to meet the folks that were involved with that. I think one of the things with Maia's work is that there are so many stories. And, I think Maia did a very skillful job pulling out a lot of really significant stories while knowing that she was cherry picking because there were, you could still be writing the stories, right? And so many of the stories of people who are no longer with us. So to bring that, I really appreciate it. So I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but I feel like I stumbled in and it was kind of like, okay, you used to use drugs, know something about public health, and is living in the Bay Area where a big chunk of my friends died of HIV. I don't know what else I could do, actually.
And that's fascinating, Lisa, because there's so many things in what you just said, but one of them is, so some people watching will be surprised, people who are not versed in this debate and this amazing history will be surprised to hear, oh, you were doing this very pragmatic, kind of obvious thing, right? We'll distribute needles because it's a bloodborne virus, right? How would you explain to people, what was the resistance you saw early on? What did you see initially?
Yeah. Some of the lines were that you're coing drug use, you're making drug use easier. To which, was always like, well, okay, I guess some people do like needles, but most people are trying to get high. They're not trying to, it's like, oh, gee, here's a needle. I can stick it in my arm. I don't even need drugs anymore. It's like, but that's what people would say. There was that line out there that, whoever the anthropologist is who came up with it, if they're still alive, they really should be gang slapped, who said it's something intrinsic to the drug use culture to share, as opposed to saying, no, when things are scarce, people share, right? If we don't have enough food and we're decent human beings, we're going to split up the food. That's just, as opposed to saying that is something that drug users do because, I don't know, drugs make you really sharey. So yeah, there were a lot of myths going around. And, I think there was also, Maia touched on it a lot in her book, some of the contradictions that were happening in the Black community, where, I would go to public sessions where people would say, well, we need medical services, we need education. We don't need needles. Don't throw needles at the problem. And it would be like, yeah, we do need all that. And to quote the late Dave Purchase, you can't put a dead dope fiend through drug treatment. But people had this very polarized, well, if you're giving needles, you're not going to be attending to these other things. And, and in fact, it's in my work in harm reduction for a while, we were working on getting treatment on demand in San Francisco. It's not either or, it's, people need the whole enchilada, right?
Yeah, that's so important. And we're going to come back to some of those kind of ginned up controversies in a little while, but thank you for that. Maia, so you obviously write brilliantly in Undoing Drugs about how harm reduction was brought to the United States in a process that Lisa played a really important part of. Can you just tell people watching a little bit about what you think are the most kind of important parts of that bringing of this European, this British Dutch import to the United States?
Sure. So it's pragmatic and it's kind, and it recognizes that everyone, that we shouldn't be saying like, well, you use drugs, so you deserve to die as an example to someone else. We don't say that with other diseases. We don't say that like, oh, you have HIV, so you should die so that people don't have sex. Or at least we hope we don't. But I was just horrified by that whole thing. The whole thing about, oh, needle exchange sends the wrong message. It sends the message that drugs are good. And, I just never got that, because it was like, no, it sends the message that we believe you deserve to live and be healthy. We may disapprove of your drug use. We may not care about your drug use, but we want you to live because you're a valuable human being. And to me, that's really at the heart of it. And that's what always moved me about it, because when I, went out with the early needle exchange people in New York, it was just like you would see all these people come rushing up, and they were, homeless and had, very marginalized people from all over the place. And, if you were with them in a drug deal, you might worry. But here, everybody was just supportive. And they were just so astonished that anybody would risk arrest in order to help them. Because most people would just go on the other side of the street if they were there. And so when they saw, wow, these people care, and they don't have an agenda of making me stop doing what I'm doing that I feel is the thing that allows me to survive. And when you start to feel that way, when you start to see that somebody cares, you can begin to care about yourself more. And you can begin to think about changing, because when you value yourself more, you start to think, well, maybe there's other stuff I could do. Maybe this isn't the only way I could live. Maybe, I know that guy who's giving out needles, he's in recovery. Maybe I could do what he does. And so suddenly you get this transformation out of something that people would assume, oh, you give them needles, you're just telling them, go get high, instead of saying, get high, whatever, but we care and want you on this planet. And that's just such a powerful message. And it's so hard to see that when you're not there in the process of, talking with people and doing it, because it looks from the outside, like it doesn't, the miracle that it is not as visible until you understand just how important it is for somebody who's addicted to actually have a moment of just being human and being seen as a human and not being seen as an object who has to be fixed. And I can tell you that from my own experience during addiction, that, when everybody literally thinks you're something to be avoided, somebody treating you nicely is amazing.
And that's so profound, Maia, and that's something that really infuses the book, because it's one of the things I think is really distinctive and there's so many important things about your book, but really distinctive about it. Because very often when we talk about harm reduction, it's certainly not true of Lisa, but very often when we talk about harm reduction, when we're publicly communicating it, we talk in this quite technocratic language. We talk about, studies show open and needle exchange, HIV goes down by, 90%. And obviously that's a very important language in which to speak, and when communicating to medical professionals and public figures. But what you've just said is, to me, the much more profound. I really saw this on the ground in Vancouver, the downtown east side of Vancouver, which is again one of the places that pioneered harm reduction. How important that spirit of, no, we want you to live in a culture where in a culture where a lot of people have been saying for a long time, well, do we want them to survive? Let them die. Good. I interviewed Eric Sterling, who was the lawyer who drafted the drug laws for the United States. So there's obviously, when they have a committee in the Senate, there's a lawyer who has to draft into law the intentions of the senators. And he, they would have people come in and talk about, harm reduction at the height of the HIV crisis. And the senators said to him, well, yeah, but do we want them to live? Do we want them to survive? right? So in a sense, you've got to, before you address the technocracy of this is the technology that will do this thing, you've actually got to address the underlying moral question, not just in policymakers, but often, as you said, and I've seen this in my own family, in people who have addiction problems themselves, who've internalized these ideas of the society. Often they've become addicted because they've been through something terrible themselves, and then they've internalized these ideas. Well, does it? So exactly as you say, that approaching people in that spirit of love and compassion is in itself transformative, and that is deeply interconnected with the kind of more technocratic cases for it. I said that quite clumsily, but does that resonate with you, Maya?
No, absolutely. And this is also why racial justice is an essential part of harm reduction, because our laws were made for racist reasons. If we were going to have a rational drug policy, you could never have a situation where tobacco is legal and marijuana is illegal, because one of those drugs kills 50% of its heavy users. The other one has no detectable effect on mortality. So racism. And
so racism.
It's threaded through our drug policy so deeply because, for example, if putting people in jail was a great way to actually treat addiction, don't you think the celebrities and the rich and famous would be like, yeah, I want to be in jail, that'll fix me. And, yeah, I mean, to say it is to refute it because it is so absurd. We don't use this for any other disease. And we don't, once you see that the horrific stigma associated with addiction has also been forced on Black people, that it's just impossible. We have to recognize that this is driven by racism, not about how to solve addiction or how to manage drugs or how to manage the risks around drugs. And so once you see that again, being kind to people on drugs becomes critical, and valuing people who use drugs becomes critical. And that it's been amazing to see the recognition of this in the George Floyd case, where people tried the usual thing, oh, he was using fentanyl, so we can discredit him. And people were like, no, we're not having that anymore. No. And so, go ahead.
But on the flip side, it took people literally seeing a person get murdered before their very eyes. Slowly, a slow murder it took in order for people, I'm just, it's like, yeah, people did, finally say the fentanyl thing wasn't necessarily it, but that's after watching, 9 minutes of somebody get murdered.
Yeah. And
that's what it took.
It was fascinating. It was fascinating how quickly the authorities went to that and thought that would be something that exculpated the murder of George Floyd. And I'm fascinated by that. Lisa, I'm fascinated by that in relation to your work. I remember seeing there was a headline on CNN about the opioid crisis a couple of years back. I looked it up, it's still there. And it said, the innocent face of addiction. And there's a picture of a kind of young blonde woman who, of course, does deserve our love and compassion for her addiction problem. And I looked at this and I thought, fuck you, they were all innocent faces, right? When you look at this question, obviously this is at the heart of your work, what do you feel people should know that they don't know about this?
Hey, Maria. Well, before I answer that, I want to loop back to something you said earlier, just briefly. And it's about that love thing, that love thing. And this also gets back to some of your work, Johan, and that is that truly, I mean, there's data, but it's also just logic and sense that what is healing for people is community, is connection, is being seen as a human being, right? And one of the worries I have in harm reduction, which is a worry I have generally, is that as things become accepted, as it becomes bureaucratized, as it becomes brought into the mainstream, what gets paid for are the units of service, and the units of service are how many needles are handed out, or, as opposed to this other thing which is considered more intangible and amorphous. And, if I say nothing else on this call, I would like to really underscore that has to be where we keep our eyes on the proverbial prize, is that's the secret sauce. is relational, is the ability to acknowledge and see the humanity of others. The secret sauce is not this other stuff, but the other stuff is what's paid for. The other stuff is why harm reduction services get professionalized, right? We don't want people from the community necessarily. We want people with big degrees. We want people who can get on that grant proposal. And then we want to have the research. I mean, there's this whole, then we want to be part of the nonprofit industrial complex. There's this whole movement in that direction. And I think we have to keep pushing in the other, or we're going to be in trouble. The downside of being at home is that a phone is going off. So I'm going to just turn that off, and you can ask another question.
I would also just...
No, please, Maya.
I would just like to say that the heart of harm reduction and with like any intervention that really is deeply relational is very hard to measure, but is absolutely essential. And I feel like so much of drug policy, so much of the errors we make in drug policy are around measuring the wrong things. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we measure wrong, for example, is we have cut the prescription opioid supply by 60% since 2011. And what do we see? More overdose, not less. Why is that? Because cutting supplies does not actually cure addiction. And anybody who thought that, what were they thinking? They were just thinking, oh, we'll cut them off and then this problem will go away. Or we'll let the ones who are already hooked can just go die off, and then, they will save the kids or something. But just focused on that measure of we've cut prescribing, so we've done our job and all is good. We've given out 20 needles, so all is good and we've done our job. No, you have to see, how is this affecting people's quality of life? Are people doing better? And are people connecting with each other? Are people feeling better? Are people doing better? And that is really difficult in a systemic way, but it is not impossible. And I think that Lisa's absolutely right that if we just keep our eyes on that, it's not as unmeasurable as we think.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, Lisa, especially that's especially profound warning in a society that has such an industrialized view of just addiction treatment generally, right? And Maia wrote a brilliant book about this, where there's just this monstrous industry that really, in a lot of cases, really harms people. And I was thinking, as you were saying that, Maia, as well, about part of the problem, and this really comes through in your book in so many different places. Part of the problem is if you have the wrong theory about what addiction is, you're going to have the wrong outcomes. So they have this absurd theory that addiction is just caused by exposure to the drug, right? We all know that's not true with alcohol, right? Everyone, of course, it's ludicrous, right? Almost everyone in the United States has tried alcohol. Very few of them become addicted. The ones that do, we know it's because of deep underlying pain. There's this line, Marianne Faithfull, the great British...
of course, yeah.
It really annoys me that often to Americans, I have to say she was Mick Jagger's girlfriend, but that annoys me.
Oh, no!
Much better than Mick Jagger. Right? She has this line in her memoir, a brilliant memoir, that I believe she actually wrote herself because she's an extremely clever and amazing person. There's this line, so she was homeless in the 60s for a while, and she had an addiction problem. And she said, heroin saved my life, because if it wasn't for heroin at that point in my life, I would have killed myself. Which of course is very challenging. And of course, Marianne Faithfull is not saying heroin is a good solution to despair. But if we engage with what Marianne Faithfull, and of course a huge amount of science that we've all written about, tells us that pain is the driver of addiction, that the core of addiction is about trying to not be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. Once you understand that's what addiction is about, of course, what you just said, Maia, makes perfect sense. What you're saying, Lisa, makes perfect sense. Things that reduce people's pain, their humiliation, their shame, over time, reduce their addictive behaviors. Does that resonate with you, Lisa?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, it has been clear to me for a long time that we're a massive society of trauma. That we have interpersonal trauma, the ways we treat each other. Then we can look at racism and the creation of poverty, and then I listened to an interesting talk by yesterday by a woman named who was a Zen person named Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who was talking about white supremacy in the United States as being a form of sociopathy. And, you know, and it's something that we're taught, you know, and that in order to maintain sociopathy, we have to lie and create myths. And I think she was specifically talking, you know, if we look at what's happening with critical race theory and this whole thing about how we have to create myths and then we have to lie to perpetuate the myths, in part because we want to feel okay about what we've done. You know, and I mean that collectively as a society. You know, you've done genocide, you don't want to feel badly about it, so you lie about it. And so, you know, I think about this pain that we have, in addition to the physical pain that people experience and everything. And it's a surprise that relatively few people are engaging in chaotic drug use. You know, I think that there are so many other ways that people manifest that pain, some of which are even more pathological because they involve hurting other people. You know, so yeah, we fail. I very much appreciate what Marianne Faithfull said, and frankly, I would appreciate anything Marianne Faithfull said because she is a goddess. Let's just be clear,
goddess.
Okay? But that said, that yeah, I'm sure it was healing for her, and not healing in ways that people would like to see, but in a way that kept her going long enough to find other answers.
That's so beautifully put. Yeah, Maia, please.
Oh yeah, I think, you know, opioids are the chemistry of love. They are the chemistry that bonds us to each other naturally. They're our own brain. Opioids are what makes mom warm and wonderful and who we want to hang out with. And, you know, and the baby so beautiful and your lover so amazing. So, you know, we talk about oxytocin and dopamine, but those are only connecting to the opioids. So it is hardly surprising that people who feel loveless and people who feel despair are going to turn to these drugs. Now, that doesn't mean that that is the answer, but it also doesn't mean that we should condemn them and say that, oh, they're just looking for extra pleasure. They're really, you know, they just want fun. They're not like, you know, they're not people in pain. They're just people who are faking and seeking extra pleasure. And that to me is one of the most pernicious myths about addiction, that our pain is fake. And that physical, like emotional pain is not real pain. I think the way we have looked at the opioid thing these days is just a nightmare, because we've decided that opioids are cigarettes and therefore people who need them must be silenced, except if it's buprenorphine and methadone under very controlled circumstances. And this has prevented us from actually enacting a genuine harm reduction policy on a national level. Because if we were to do that, we would have to allow doctors to prescribe a safe supply to people. And this is not saying they should be, you know, just taking out the prescription pen randomly and like giving 13-year-olds opioids. But except if they happen to have cancer and actually happen to need them. You know, but the point is just that moving people from a medical supply that at least with a known dose and purity to a street supply that's poisoned with fentanyl has done more harm, at least as much harm, as all that opioid marketing that we're screaming about now. And so it's very frustrating. And I think it takes us away from, again, seeing the humanity of people in pain, whether it's emotional or physical or both.
You're so right, Maia, and it's been so maddening to see the debate about the opioid crisis being kind of dominated by, I think of it as a sort of a liberal version, only slightly liberal version of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. It's the evil drug dealers gave people this unique, potent drug. It hijacked them. And the solution is to stop the evil drug dealers, except now the evil drug dealers are the Sackler family, who are indeed repulsive people. I'm sure we all agree. But it's this ludicrously simplified solution. Solution, in inverted commas, as we see it, hasn't worked. But I'm interested, I really want us to think about, I mean, one of the many great things about your book, Maia, is that because it's a storytelling book, not a didactic argument-based book, I think it's much more heart-opening than a lot of the previous contributions to the harm reduction debate. And it's so important that you've done that. And, you know, and I know as a journalist very well, it's cheap and easy to make arguments. It takes a lot of work and effort to do storytelling, and you've done that so amazingly. I want us to just think about. It seems to me, and please correct me if you guys think I'm being too simplistic here. There seem to me to be two broad sets, sort of two broad types of objections to harm reduction. So one is what we might call a kind of reactionary right-wing view, which is that, like those people said to Eric Sterling when he was writing the drug laws, do we even want them to live? Right. I once interviewed Viktor Ivanov briefly, the Russian drug czar, one of the most terrible, dead-eyed people I've ever met. And they banned needle exchange effectively because they wanted the addicted population of Russia to die. They ended up, in fact, supercharging their HIV crisis, of course, and killing a lot of them. So let's set aside that objection, because I think we've addressed that, and I doubt there's many people watching the Strand feeds who have that view. A more complicated argument for us to engage with, and I think you've both done it brilliantly, is what we might think of as the recovery community objections to harm reduction. So Lisa, I'm sure you came across some of them. How did you encounter them, and could you talk a bit about that?
I mean, certainly in the early days, it was really polarized, right? I mean, people were saying it is either recovery, and I'm even putting that in quotes because I think recovery can be a larger, more capacious thing than getting off of drugs. It's either recovery and abstinence, or it's harm reduction. That was how it was framed out there. And those of us in harm reduction were vilified. It was almost like somebody was imagining that we were snatching people in recovery out of the recovery, shooting them up with heroin, and then sending them off again. So, and then there were people in harm reduction, many of whom had been hurt in varying forms of the recovery community, who were like, "Oh, we're not having anything to do with that." There are a bunch of I think the expression, and I'm not, and if this offends anybody, I apologize. I'm quoting it. I'm not endorsing it. Is people used to talk about 12-step mind slaves. That everybody was kind of marching in line with the 12-step thing. So I think that there was a polarization, and I think it's a false one. Certainly people who are very active in harm reduction have been part of the recovery community. I'm looking at the chat, and two of my favorite people on this planet, Alan Clear and
I love Alan.
How can you not love him? Oh. I hope he's blushing right now. And Mary Howe, my white daughter, who runs an outreach for youth in the Haight, are both have been part of the recovery community. And are abstinent pretty much, or by whatever definition. And they are absolute harm reduction leaders. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I think some of the polarization has died down just because people on both sides realize that it's ludicrous. That abstinence is absolutely the best thing for some people. Then it always gets called to mind, abstinence to what? I mean, I know for myself, there are some substances that I need to abstain from because I will act a fool. There are other drugs that I can, be more, that I have a lot more leeway with. So, I think, again, looking ahead at harm reduction, it would also be helpful to have a more nuanced conversation where we can develop more skills, and so that people can diagnose how they can use in a way that's salubrious, that's not harmful. I know that Dan Bigg and those folks were working on some use guides, and I think that needs to be completely developed, including, and then I will stop. But one of my obsessions has been the issue of how ritual, the cultures of use and the cultures of ritual tend to create containers around how we use substances, right? And this is why, it's considered, okay, I'm having a couple of drinks with dinner, that's not harmful. But if I start drinking while driving to work, that's considered problematic. I mean, there are all these rituals of use that create more helpful use. And I wish we could, I'd like us to do more work with that, including looking at the edges of those containers so that people don't go into chaotic use, who are using.
I love the way you put that. Because we need these containers, and when things are criminalized, it's really hard to create them because we're so caught up in dealing with criminalization and trying to avoid, that. So I think that is definitely crucial. And I liked the Chicago Recovery Alliance's "Any positive change is recovery."
Right.
Now, I understand the problem that people with long-term abstinence may have with that because they worked very, very hard to get the long-term abstinence that they had. And that is absolutely respectable and important and should not be dismissed. The thing is, before you get to that point, oftentimes you are actually doing work while you are still listening.
Yeah.
And some people are never going to be able to get into recovery without doing some of that trauma work while they still have the drug to escape into. So I think we can have it both ways. And I think that, for example, I think that if you had, let's say you had 10 years of complete abstinence, continuous abstinence, and then you use for one day, in the traditional recovery view, now you have one day and those 10 years are erased. I would say you should have, get 90 days back, then you get your 10 years back. Because your 10 years haven't been erased. And I feel like we can come to things like this that can bridge that gap. I started my own recovery in 12-step recovery and being like a very fierce abstentionist for a while. And so I think it's really important to embrace everybody who has different experiences and recognize that, just like a harm reduction recovery where you use on weekends isn't for everybody, similarly, abstinence isn't for everybody, and we should just respect the path that people find that works for them. And that can be hard because we can feel jealous and we can be like, how come they get to do that? But it's really important to just address that rather than just being rigid. And I think, okay, probably early in recovery, a lot of people are going to have rigidity, but over time we can work together. And I tried to address in the book specifically that this is not a diatribe against the 12 steps, and that you can absolutely be a 12-stepper and be a harm reductionist. But it's really important to embrace the ecumenical bits and to, as they say, take what that you like and leave the rest as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's so important, Maya, because sometimes the way I try to communicate to people who are skeptical or don't quite see these arguments is to say, for something as complex as human addiction, we need a broad menu of options. Now, for some people, the right thing on the menu 100% will be 12 steps programs, including someone very close to me that saved their lives. For other people, that'll be completely wrong. It's not the right thing. And, there's I can think of almost no complex human phenomena where there is one solution for absolutely everyone who encounters that phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's a bizarrely rigid way of thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. I think about antidepressants, where for me, this has completely helped me not or have less of the sensory overload that I had since day zero. And this allows me to interact, present, and be there for people. Somebody else might take the same exact drug and be completely numb and find themselves really distant and feel horrible. Does that make this drug bad? No, it just means different people have different chemistries and they respond differently to different things. And this is true of not just the human brain, but all the social stuff that goes around it. Like, I might, like to go to car shows or something, and you might like to go to cat shows. But prescribing one for the other, I'm on the cat side.
Let's just establish car shows are objectively a form of mental illness. Cats are objectively fabulous. But so your analogy just broke down. I understand your word.
Something that not at all appeal to me, but does appeal to some people very clearly. So, but whatever it is, like, I can't assign you a sense of meaning and purpose and love because you're different, and you and I have all kinds of different things. Like, we may have in common the fact that we all need a sense of purpose and meaning and love, but we're going to get those in very different ways.
That's so
And that we
important.
need to embrace the difference. We embrace the difference. We don't try to pretend that it's not there. It's what's lovely about being human.
Right.
Yeah, that's so. I just want to let everyone watching know that we're going to take some questions. If you guys want to put them in the little chat on Facebook or in the Zoom. So I'm so technologically illiterate. I was trying to think of the word for Zoom. But so I feel like there's another aspect to this. I feel like this is a safe space so we can talk about a slightly difficult aspect of this debate, which is, so there's an easier argument, which I make when you put it really well, Maia, the idea of it being a bridge. We're trying to build a bridge. We want to build coalitions that get people the help they need. So the bridge argument, which is absolutely true, it's not a kind of, sophistry, is dead people don't detox. We keep people alive. If people die, they can't ever recover. So if we keep people alive, they've got a chance of recovering. Now, that argument is true, and it's an important argument to make. There is an area where I think the three of us do diverge somewhat from 12 Steps people, while hugely respecting the people who've been helped by that, which is, how would I put it? I'll speak for myself rather than speaking for either of you, and then please tell me if you disagree, or we can explore some of these thoughts. For me, the goal of helping people with addiction problems is not necessarily abstinence. Now, for a lot of them it is, but some of the people closest to me, it has been. There are lots of people with addiction problems where the only way they can recover from their addiction is to become entirely abstinent from that drug, or substance, or behavior indeed. It could be gambling or porn or whatever it is. There are, however, and this is where we would diverge, or I would certainly, is there are also, it's just a reality that there are such people, and we have to be honest about it. There are lots of people who have had an addiction problem whose recovery doesn't involve entirely abstaining. Some people can move to moderated use, but there's I'll just shut up in a second, but there's almost a layer below that, which is too often, I don't want to say everyone, and I don't think it's a majority, but too often in the addiction treatment world, there can be the implication that a life where someone is continuing their addictive behavior is effectively a kind of living death. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, I would like to address that, because when I first visited Liverpool, actually, I was in my serious 12-step phase, and I thought that, people on methadone, well, they're being kept alive, but they're not in recovery, and they're not emotionally present, and they're not able to experience life's ups and downs the way you should, the way a lot of people say about antidepressants, actually. And I learned very quickly that that was a ridiculous way of seeing things, and that the idea that while you are actively addicted, nothing means anything and nothing counts is very pernicious. And I just don't like that view in the 12 steps. That's something I would leave. I think that it is certainly possible for someone to numb themselves and miss out on things, but it's also possible to numb themselves in order to be able to stay here on this planet. And we can't make that choice for other people. We need to help people to have access to the biggest amount of tools that they possibly can to be able to live a full and connected life. But my idea of that and your idea of that may be very different. And some people have been through so much that they are going to need some form of chemical assistance forever. And I just don't want to judge that. I don't want to judge people, for doing what works for them. And the question, of course, becomes, well, what if it isn't working for them? I am not God. I can't fix them. I can try to reach out and try to support them and do my little motivational interviewing thing and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that if we see people as being trapped in false consciousness, we end up dehumanizing them. And we need to stop that.
Oh, that's so brilliantly put. Lisa, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I agree thoroughly. I mean, the only addition I would make is that we have so many kind of clandestine moralism things we do. And one of the moralism bits is that somehow you're a more enlightened person if you're not addicted or not habitually doing something, using substances, that somehow that makes you a better person. You know, you can be Lord God asshole, but if you can prove that you don't have any of these sticky ties to substances, or you don't have to prove it, you just have to front it, then that somehow makes you a better person than somebody else. You know, my years in harm reduction taught me that assholes come in all shapes, sizes, colors, and has nothing to do with whether or not you use or not. And so I think that that's what I'd like to see more separated is, yeah, people need to be accountable for asshole behavior. People who use, people who don't use, right? But that instead we conflate all that stuff and we start saying, oh, well, the problem is you're using. It's like, no, actually.
I feel like that about when you hear about, you know, the idea in obviously in the 12 steps of doing a fearless moral inventory. Now we can all benefit from doing a fearless moral inventory, 100%.
Yeah.
Every human being. But
Absolutely.
I do think there is a degree, if we're honest, of internalized stigma in the idea that people with addiction problems uniquely or especially need to do a moral inventory.
And this is why I am opposed to 12-step within treatment. I believe that it creates, if you're not going to have depressed people or people with schizophrenia or people with cancer take moral inventory, you can't be having people with addiction take moral inventory and be calling that treatment. That may be a perfectly wonderful thing that helps people as self-help, but it should never be mandatory or part of a curriculum of something that we're paying for one thing, because you can get it for free elsewhere. I do think that like whatever substances are in my blood are not what matters. What matters is how am I treating other people? How am I treating myself? How am I treating my cat?
Yeah,
exactly. We should start doing Q&A just because I'm feeling.
Are we? Can you send us over the questions? I can't. Can you guys see any in the?
I can see some because I'm realizing that really what I want to do is just kick it with you two for like about 5 hours and maybe some substances involved and definitely food. But since that's not possible, I can't be selfish here. And so are you able?
So I can see, what if fearless moral inventory triggers trauma? That's asked by Harm Reduction Sisters.
Oh,
okay.
I will say I have a lot to say about that. I think for many women and anybody who comes from a marginalized group, that is often the case, because what I have actually seen happen is people who were sexually abused as children being told to find out what their part was in that. Their part was nothing in that. They were victimized by a predator. There is nothing you did wrong in that. And to make people say that everything that happened to you, you had a part in, that is just wrong. Like, it's just like saying to a Holocaust survivor, well, you asked for it. Like, no. You know, and that is one of the side effects of people misusing the concept of moral inventory, because the concept was made by like rich white men, and they probably were jerks to a lot of people, and they weren't sexually abused, and they did have a part in what happened to them. But to assume and generalize that to everybody is really harmful. And I think when you're talking about people with a history of trauma, which is like at least 2/3 of people with addiction, forcing anything is really bad, because trauma is an experience of being completely powerless and out of control in a way that feels life-threatening. And if you recreate that situation by saying your life depends on you must do this, and you must find your part in every, you know, thing that you list on your moral inventory, no, like just no. And you know, and I think that this is also why it's a really bad idea to have people work the 12 steps within a rehab, because, you know, within 10 days of abstinence, you are definitely not in a position to be able to address like these kinds of serious trauma. And that's not being trauma informed.
You know, Maya, I saw an illustration of that really haunts me. I was in Regina in Saskatchewan in Canada, and a lot of you will know, so obviously everyone I'm hoping knows, that First Nations people were subjected to a genocide by the European invasion. unimaginable horror and trauma. We're just seeing now, the excavation of so-called boarding schools, which should be called forced re-education camps of First Nations children, where they're just finding loads of dead bodies all over Canada. But so in the wake of this monstrous trauma, very large, there's disproportionately large levels of addiction problems among First Nations people. No shit, Sherlock, right?
And then
Well, what happens is those people are, a lot of them are profoundly traumatized, the people who've got addiction problems there. And then I remember, so I spoke to someone there who unfortunately wouldn't let me quote him, but he said, his experience of his community was this huge level of addiction. And then a bunch of white people arrive and tell them, you've got to do a moral inventory of your flaws. And he said, fuck you, how dare you fucking tell me to do a moral inventory? You
do the moral inventory.
Yeah.
You do it. You do it. Right. Yeah.
Stole our children. You murdered our ancestors. We are traumatized, and you tell us that we have to do a moral inventory. It's a remarkable way of talking and thinking. But when you see it in that colonial context, I think you can see some of the cruelty of what is done in a less overtly and less violently colonial context, like just a very vulnerable person, being told this narrative about their pain that the vulnerable person may come to share, but may not. And being told, and Maia, you've done great work on this before in your previous books, particularly if people reject those narratives in most addiction treatment centers in the United States, they're told they're not engaging, they're not, they don't, do you want to die? We've all heard these terrible stories about it. Just looking for other, if anyone's got any other questions, please do put them in the
and
the
also,
box.
Lisa, I wondered if you had any reaction to that as well.
Yeah, please.
Well, other than like my head blowing off just from that story you told, the other thing that came to mind though was Rise, which is a youth center here that's extraordinary, that is truly about trying to empower youth who are, at risk for every heinous thing. And their youth are mostly youth of color, many queer youth, et cetera, poor youth, is that there's this thing called ACEs that have become very popular, where people are looking at all the ways people are traumatized. And one of the things that Rise has done, and they've written about it, is talk about structural violence as being traumatizing and putting that in the models. If we actually could put that in, then that would move the finger. One of the things I often teach my students, or yell at my students, because I tend to be a very hectoring teacher, is the people that have the problem are usually not the ones who cause the problem. And so if we want to solve a problem, we need to look at who's causing it, not who has it. Right. And so that story you told, it's like, yeah, people, to have people who are not directly culpable for the camps that these children were put in, but people who are just completely not even dealing with it, and who have this individualized focus, which you can only have in our kind of gaslit, again, sociopathic, white supremacist culture. It just makes me want to throw up. It's like, how could it's another violation of those folks, which, so I'm gonna go over here and breathe. And Mary's putting, no, not ACEs, but that's my kid.
It's funny. I want to add something to that. Like, as someone who's, I co-wrote a book about trauma called The Boy Who Raises a Dog with Bruce Perry. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the first books that brought out the fact that child trauma is such an important influence on people. And that does not mean we should force people to disclose their childhood trauma every time they go to the doctor. Or that because you have childhood trauma, now you can't get opioids for your pain because you were at risk based on whatever, and it's just the misuse of these things is enormous. I like somebody put in there should be a balance to ACEs, a privilege score, which is
So I've just realized I've done a really incompetent thing, which is I've been looking at the chat box, and there's a separate Q&A box. I wonder why there were no questions. I wonder why you were saying, Lisa, look at the Q&A. Lisa, I really apologize. I did warn you guys I was a technological incompetent on a massive scale. But
the chat is really lovely though. If you've been following it, people have really good comments. Just as a Just
So
saying.
I'm just gonna, unfortunately we have to wrap up in a few minutes, but I'm just gonna read out a few of the questions, and Lisa, Maya, you guys just pick up which ones you want to look at. So Kyle Stern says, I grew up with the DARE campaign. Given my socioeconomic status where I grew up, these sorts of approaches unsurprisingly did not work. In your opinion, what are some of the effective ways government can approach the youth drug narrative? Someone said, what direction do you hope to see drug harm reduction go in the future? So Donald McDonald said, which is an excellent name, said, can you tell folks about harm reduction mutual aid, like Harm Reduction Works? Someone has said, any recommendations of movies or documentaries for new harm reduction? The only thing you need is Maia's book and the documentary that will inevitably be made of it. Dean McClyer has said, how can we ensure that unprecedented levels of federal funding for harm reduction don't become part of the problem and more of the same? And Alex, who takes the last one, do you think psychedelics such as DMT, psilocybin, etc., can have the potential to help people with severe addiction problems? So we haven't got time for all of that.
Real quickly. So first of all, in terms of prevention, deal with trauma early. Like, don't be focused on drugs. Be focused on the fact that most people who develop addictions have a predisposition that is some kind of genetic outlying thing. So you might be extremely bold or extremely anxious or extremely whatever. If you're extremely something, you probably are going to have difficulty fitting in. You're probably going to then get bullied. You're probably going to then feel isolated and lonely and be at higher risk. So the prevention should be sort of socio-emotional learning kind of stuff, but not telling kids to like say how traumatized they were in front of the whole class. We're working on the idea that addiction is a problem of pain and a problem of lack of connection, as you said, not a problem of drugs per se. They will need at an older age to know about the risks related to specific things, but that has to be honest and clear. I'm going to now skip to the last question and say, in terms of psychedelics, yes, I do think they have a role. I think that we need to be very careful that we don't medicalize it in a way that like just ends up oppressing poor people again and not having them have access. But I think that it's really important that we don't rush into seeing these psychedelics as like the be all and end all and the perfect cure, because nothing is going to be that. Different things are going to work for different people. And if we overhype it, we're setting ourselves up for a backlash. And we really need to not have that.
Yeah. And Lisa, what are your thoughts about those questions?
Well, about that last one, I also want to, again, we tend to commodify everything. And so I absolutely psychedelics can be helpful, but it's not just, okay, take 2 and call me in the morning. The use of psychedelics, whether it's been with indigenous cultures or whether it's currently, is always been, not always, but is very successfully been within containers, right? That are trying to address and support people. And often the containers are social again, the recurring themes, right? So I think in American culture where it's like, oh, DMT works, okay, I'll take some. Oh, well, that didn't work, I'll take more. That makes me nervous. And I'm not saying that in a prohibition sort of way. I'm just saying it in we need to look at ourselves and look at how we do these things and look at how we produce harm by doing it, the ways we've been taught. And, and reteach ourselves. And look at what other cultures do, not in an appropriative way, but in a, people have been doing some stuff for thousands of years. Maybe we can learn something. But in answer to all those questions, we need 5 more hours. Easy.
I'm just going to say, I'm just going to try to answer one of the questions with my perspective. That's okay, just super quickly, which is where harm reduction can go. I think a lot about another wonderful harm reductionist, Liz Evans, who ran the Portland Hotel Society in Vancouver for a long time and is a great person. And Liz often says, and I know that both of you would agree with this, Liz often says part of the problem is we've defined harm reduction very narrowly. We've defined it as these interventions, which are hugely important and life-saving. But she said, biggest single form of harm reduction in the whole of Vancouver was housing, provision of more housing. No one is going to recover from an addiction.
That's right.
You can't do homelessness sober, right?
Period.
Or another form of harm reduction that's absolutely essential was tried by Portugal, end the drug war, decriminalize all drugs, stop punishing people, use that money instead to help them. What happened when they did that? Addiction more than halved. So I think we need to, one of the things that's such a great tool, Maia's book, because it tells these stories. It's very hard for someone to read this book, even someone who was quite skeptical at the start, and not see, okay, these interventions have saved people's lives. How do we then take, and Maia wrote about this beautifully in the New York Times as well, how do we then take that concept and run with it? How do we expand it so much more? I think that the Strand is going to cattle prod me if I don't end soon. But Maia, will you hold your book up to the camera? You have to say something or the Zoom won't switch back to you.
Gotcha. Yes, and I just want to say, yeah, like basically the whole point of this is to say harm reduction is a philosophy. These are tools within it, but you can add new ones like we did back in the day. And you want to see what those are because they're going to be different and context matters a lot. Like the intervention that works in one situation may do harm in another. And this is why you actually have to focus on harm. And thank you so much.
Well, I just want to say to everyone, you must now go into the little chat box and order a copy of Maia's book, or I personally will morally judge you. And if you don't now buy the book, you are strongly in favor of killing any vulnerable person. So make the choice. Thank you to Lisa, who's been completely amazing. Thank you to Maia, who's done this incredible, poured her heart and her intellect, both of which are so formidable, into this book. Thank you to Avi at the Strand, and thank you to all of you for watching. And we'll do this again, I'm sure. And when plague is over, we're all going to meet in San Francisco, and we're going to get hammered. Okay?
Sounds great.
Thank you all so much.
I'm going to buy the first round. Okay, I got it. I got it.
I will let you. And I'm going to try and persuade Marianne Faithful to come as well. So we'll. Okay, brilliant. Thanks, everyone.
Right.
Love.
Thank you. Have a good evening,
you.
everybody.
Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now. Take care.